Well, thank you for having me.
So I'm very interested in the work you've been doing lately. There's so many papers you've been writing. And to get into that, though, I want to think about your personal trajectory because the papers that I want to talk to you about are a lot about cognitive computing and active inference and modeling and technology and AI and all these sort of subjects. However, I seem to have discovered or heard that you started in more humanities and sociology and even something called sexology, which I'm not sure how to define exactly. So, could you help me?
So I'll start by defining what sexology is, because it is a concern that sexologists themselves coming out of university are trained to answer.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
I'll start with that, and then I'll tell you about my path.
Thank you.
Sexology is basically an amalgamation of a lot of fields. You can go biology, psychology, anthropology. We do a lot of sociology as well, sometimes linguistics, sometimes media studies. And effectively, it's about the topic itself. So anything that touches on anything related, even tangentially to sexuality, like pregnancy or diseases, it can be couples therapy, it can be well-being. So these are all the topics that are touched on. And so we dissect these topics from multiple aspects and try to find the connection points between the fields that find areas of, I want to say synergy, but mostly impact. Because what we are more and more going towards in the social sciences field is psycho-ecological, biological approach where you can't just see one in isolation. You have to
Yeah.
take it all into account. And
Mm,
that creates a problem
mm,
because it's a great desire, but
mm,
we don't have the right bridges, the right paths between the different fields of study, such that sometimes the languages don't match. Sometimes we think the languages match, but really we're talking about different things. And sometimes the methodologies themselves aren't even aligned. So we couldn't even try to measure the same thing if we wanted. And that goes beyond the problem of scale. Oftentimes, when you talk about a field, we're talking about related things, but they're acting at a different scale. So for instance, we're talking about psychology and then sociology. In general, we think we're talking about phenomena that act on, say, the individual scale. And then we're talking about topics that span multiple people, multiple individuals, and then even institutions and countries that become their own groups. So we are lacking the tools to understand the ways in which these things interact. So that's, I think, gets to how I started my path
yeah,
and where I am
definitely. I
today.
can see that.
Yeah, right? Like
Yeah.
I started in sexology because really I was interested in psychology, but I didn't want to do just what my understanding of psychology was at the time, just like more than 10 years ago. I really thought that I wanted to get into something practical and useful and that would get to the root of what is being a human being. And
Mm,
to me, sexuality, there was something fundamental about it that
mm,
spoke to the deep connections that we can make with other people, and therefore something transcendental about the way that we relate to one another. Unfortunately, I was a bit let down. The field is not what I thought it was. It mostly talks about, communicable diseases and, the kinds of things you do when you're pregnant and what happens
mm,
to your body. And all of this is massively important, but not exactly what I went into it for.
mm,
So then I did my master's thinking, let's push this a little bit further. Let's go into culture. Let's try to understand how culture is this sort of framework that shapes our perception of reality and therefore a perception of each other and how we might exchange through these cultural artifacts. And I got a little further to closer to where I wanted to go. But then again, I was limited by the fact that the fields are hazy and a little bit blurry. They mean to be blurry, it's on purpose, because they mean to be inclusive and try to not apply a frame of reference that is not appropriate to phenomena that is poorly understood and that may not be where the researcher is coming from. So they acknowledge that there is a bias from being human and existing in the world that you can't really get away from. And so we try to acknowledge and pull the bias away a little bit by keeping things a bit blurry, not defining too much, letting the definitions stem from the people, the cultures you're studying. But that doesn't give us a lot of explanatory power. It doesn't give us a lot of predictive power. And so it stays a bit there. It's like, okay, let's make a description. It's beautiful, it's poetic, it's abstract, and we can't do anything with it.
Mm.
And I find that that also leads to a perception from the, let's say, hard sciences, the life sciences, that it's useless, that it's not even science. That oftentimes we separate these sciences because they don't even consider social sciences to be a science. I'm saying that it's a broad thing, not everybody thinks that way, but I've really encountered people who wouldn't even qualify the humanities as a science. And so I was a bit flustered by that. I wanted to go further. I wanted to find what constituted building blocks. And anytime I mentioned the word ontology, I was met with heavy criticism because they were like, no, 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 ontology is an essentialist concept. We are not essentialist here. We're constructivists. And I believe that. I believe that things are constructed. I believe that culture shapes the way we engage with reality, and that culture itself is a construct of interactions and phenomena, which is why I'm very interested in neomaterialism. But I don't believe that this means you can't come up with essential processes, essential building blocks that lead people to potentially predictably make certain assumptions or predictably think in a way that will lead them to act in a certain way. And so that's how I got into trying to think further and find paradigms that were heading in that direction. And I found predictive processing. I was engaged a lot with a community at that time that was really involved with AI, even though I wasn't part of that community. But at the same time, I was learning how to program. I built a company, a sex tech company. We were doing, at this time it was web development, but therefore I was getting more interested in it. We were linking patients with sexologists who wanted to give them care across the country, because one of the main issues is access. In rural areas, you don't have access. And so, but because I was learning how to program, because I was learning about this community and AI and their concerns, I started reading about cognitive theories that had these building blocks, even though they weren't specifically interested in social sciences for now. And that's how I fell in the work of Maxwell Ramstad and Carl Friston, who were starting to discuss niche construction, which was very reminiscent of ecological theory, which I was very familiar with, having studied in my master's. So I was seeing that they were making these connections, and I brought into the field the notion of social scripts, and we formalized this, and now we have some degree of the building blocks. And the missing piece still, to some extent, is how you map across scales to get an emergent feature, because active inference is scale free, but it doesn't give you emergence per se. You still need to understand the historicity of a system in order to understand how certain things emerge at a given scale through some attractor dynamics.
Okay, wow, there's so much in there. And now I can sort of understand how you got into this, because there's a kind of strange set of constraints in both these areas that you're in. I mean, I've kind of been in both too, and more philosophy, but I think it's similar in a way. We're trying to take account of multiple perspectives, like something like constructivism that you said, where we kind of understand, having read so deeply and like tried to see from so many perspectives, that everyone's got a little bit of a different trajectory. And even when we're in a shared space and looking at the same object or in the same encounter, even we're perceiving it differently. And so you kind of start with that, and then you feel as if you can't really put anything seemingly objective or ontological onto that. And then on the opposite side, in science, it seems almost, this is all, I'm generalizing in a big way, but it seems like we take away all of that stuff and try to get to something that's very distilled, that will kind of work no matter what. And then that also ends up in a strange constraining place, which I think something like active inference is starting to explode a bit. And it kind of, for me, has to do with the possibility of modeling. And to get into this a bit, I wonder, are you the one who brought in the idea of the phenomenology into all of this? Because I've started seeing that word coming a lot. And I wonder, did you study some of that early on, or was that someone else? Or
So I'm not the one who brought it. That was definitely Anil Seth, Maxwell Ramstad, and a group of other researchers who really started getting familiar with this. They wrote a paper, I think, on the computational account of generative passages. This is not the right title. I'll send you the paper later.
Yeah, okay.
But they started it. They were very interested in computational phenomenology, but I am also interested in it, and I've done some work in that field. And my main interest was how phenomenology becomes shared. So intersubjectivity and how it can become shared is through the common constructs that we have that allow us to parse reality at all. And those can be very basic, like time and space. You start with that. From those basic constructs, then you extend on qualitative expectations, and those qualitative expectations then become sort of constrained and patterned, and that's how you get to potentially, scripts and culture and language and anything like that that has something that can be hooked onto that allows us to compute further than just the momentary thing that's happening.
So I don't know. I just want to say something and see what you think. I feel like in a way we're kind of stuck in like a flat world understanding where let's talk about something like sentient behavior is sort of what we're trying to understand in a way, right? Or what you are trying to understand with active inference modeling and so on. And this goes into cognition. Maybe you can correct me on that. But in a big kind of way, we're trying to understand sentient behavior and cognition, and all these bigger issues come out of that, of how communities form and different sort of pretensions and so on. But it still seems like to me when we talk about it, maybe just in everyday life, when we think about behavior or cognition, we still have a linear sort of model of, we start with a cell and we end up with AI, and it should all fit together on a kind of a line somehow. And I feel like what you were kind of expressing with the humanities and this constructivist multi-dimensional view is very hard to kind of fit into that way of thinking or modeling in science. But I feel like reading your papers, especially the ones on scripts, the polysemous idea and there's many, many things where I'm starting to feel like it's opening up and becoming multi-dimensional. I don't know, just saying that, what does that correct me, or how does that strike you?
No, I think it resonates a lot. I mean, the problem where we face with science is that you're trying to establish causality. That's the thing, right? It's easy to establish correlation, but causality is tough.
Yeah.
And so what you're trying to do is like move away all the possible noise to find one strand of possible causal relation. So obviously you want to try to make it as linear as possible. And ideally you want to make it reductionist because then it's simple, right? If you can start with a thing, you can just kind of like start it and it'll become what you need with this one principle. You don't have to. So that would be ideal. But again, this is what I was saying about the emergent structures that only occur on a given scale. Because we can't yet predict this very well, we are unable to fully grasp how different factors come in. But we are indeed interested in it, and I think that's what Varela was trying to get to with the ecological sciences. We are trying to do the same right now. Active inference is basically also heading towards having a proper understanding of how different kinds of observations lead to some types of beliefs, and those can be obviously as varied as you'd like. They can take in different kinds of factors, different kinds of scales, and I feel like because it's being applied in different fields at the same time, we are getting some way to sort of hook all these things together, but we haven't quite yet found the proper way to hook them. We have a language, we have a common language, active inference, we have a common set of processes, which eventually all lead back to cognition and fundamental principles of how information is encoded on boundaries, which itself is pretty fundamental. So in a sense, it's reductionist in that sense, but it doesn't necessarily entail that there are no emergent features. So the key, I think, what someone will have to come in and do is find properly how these things can be connected. What my work is trying to do is show that the scales, are an illusion. That's the work that Maxwell Ramsted have started. I'm trying to show that even the internal external boundary idea is just a function of measurement. It's not, it's also just an illusion. So if we start to understand this and we can cast away these artificial boundaries, then maybe we can find the true way in which things interact, and therefore the ways in which different modeling ideas that are in active inference can connect to one another. But we're very far from finding the answer. A lot of work still has to be done.
But I do feel like what's happening is that there's a scaffolding of something like mathematics, but also just language and description that's come towards understanding some very basic things like how a body encounters the world. So with active inference now through mathematics, but also through, English or whatever language we speak, we can start to talk about it. It might not be exactly the right way, but we can think of it as, minimizing surprise, or basically a body moving through its encounter, aligning to those regularities. And then when something is against those regularities, having a kind of a different response. You could probably explain it better. And once we can start to understand this a little bit, is it more possible then to begin to understand that multi-perspectival or constructivist idea of that every agent would be a different spatiotemporal position, of course, and thus would have a different encounter, even as many of these regularities are shared.
But precisely,
Yeah.
that's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. I think this is why this notion of objectivity is flawed by nature. Like,
Yeah.
objectivity shouldn't mean what we generally think it means. Obviously, like you said, any body in the world will necessitate a different perspective. If only because I'm looking at this rock from here and you're looking at it from here. So our experience of the rock, our regularities related to the rock will be ever so slightly different.
Mhm.
The reason we have a language is because we're constantly trying to collapse these differences by hooking up to common experiences and trying to peel away what constitutes an error of the difference between our perception. That's what communication is. We're confronted with this never-ending paradox that what do we hook onto? At one point, there's going to be an irreducible difference in our experiences. I think that's what Slavoj Žižek is trying to get to. Whatever you think of him as a scholar, he does sort of point at this idea that at the core, there is nothing, because we can never, it's a never-ending. I think Dorito is kind of going in the same direction. It's a never-ending swapping of different things, which there's nothing behind it. I think the answer lies in phenomenology and the fact that we're not individuals that have seen only one thing, and that we are capable of sort of placing ourselves temporally within the perspective of another agent. And because we're capable of doing this temporal swapping, we're also capable of abstracting away what might constitute some degree of difference and only focusing on this statistical regularity that we have both experienced. And it's because we are temporal agents and not simply, agents that only focus on one point in time. That being said, math isn't sufficient. That's why phenomenology here is critical. Qualia in itself and understanding the relationship between matter and information and how matter translates to a representation is not yet a fully solved question. And I think it's going to be it's always been the critical question, right? It's always been the question, but we're so close.
I think there's two things that come to mind there, and it's back to that, in one way, that flatland thing I was trying to say, where I think we're smushed into this binary way of thinking. This is a lot about beyond dichotomies, and you've already sort of pushed us past them quite a few times in the way that you're trying to talk. But I do think the two things are, one is this self-other thing, right? I can see what you're saying about Slavoj and all this. There's nothing there. We could see it that way, but we could also see it that we have a kind of a strange idea of what we are, that we've taken the Markov blanket a bit too seriously, for good reason, to survive. I mean, we couldn't have even gotten here if we hadn't. So it's not to say that we did something wrong, but we're in a different place now, right? That maybe we can reimagine what is the self actually, and what is the body actually. And we can start to understand that there's a power in that community. You write a lot about community intelligence is almost the only kind of intelligence. And in a way, if we could kind of have a different realization as the spatiotemporal agent that we are, it might shift a bit what's possible in those realms. And I think that's also connected to that flat world sort of understanding that we have in the modeling too, that because you could, if we could understand that everyone has this unique spatiotemporal trajectory from birth to death, and if we could model it somehow really, like literally, we would see that there's so much overlap and that there isn't a gap actually between all of this stuff. It's just, how in the world do we visualize that and model that and put language on that?
Yeah, I think we're getting to the point of like, Do we need to recreate the universe to understand the universe,
Well,
right?
we're sort of doing it, right, with digital twins of everything and spatial
Precisely, we're
web
getting
and
there. Like, it's a lot of people are like, well, but you need to make a map, not a territory. And it's like, well, maybe what constitutes the map that allows you to understand what is fundamentally just a map, right? Like, literally everything you perceive is just a map. So what we're trying to get to is as close to a map as a map is. It's so eventually.
exactly. That's what I mean by if we can understand it's both. That's the dichotomy. It's either a map or it's a territory. That's the way we think right now. It's either I or other. I mean, but it's so hard for us to open, like, that's the cognitive shift. Where's the third space or even the multiple space where both of those are okay, you know? Map and territory are not a choice. They're different ways of understanding a process that's kind of inseparable.
No, absolutely. And I mean, again, it's like this map territory idea gets back to, again, information and matter. And effectively, there may not even be a real difference between information or matter. Now we're getting into like physics, and I'm not going to go there too much. I will refer people to Chris Fields if they're interested, and he will have much better things to say than me. But effectively, I think what we consider to be a territory at a given scale is just a map at another, or and so that distinction is really just a function of your perspective and the way that you measure reality at this point in space and time.
But it's
And
still important. That doesn't mean it's not like it suddenly becomes meaningless, right? You know?
that's kind of what I mean as well. Like, I feel like people put valence upon certain terms.
Yeah.
Like you had to sort of shield yourself from criticism by saying it's okay that we've made the blanket important. It was, yeah, of course it is. Every process is effectively natural just by virtue of existing. So we shouldn't put a label on it. What we should, every time we qualify something as bad or good, it's relative to an objective that we had and that is being hindered by this thing. And so you could say that relative to this thing, this is not helpful in this local scale. But if you blew it up to maybe 10,000 years, maybe it would be, because maybe this is a culling mechanism or something of some kind. So like we can never say something as blanket as that. We can identify attractors relative to a state we have identified as preferable right now from our perspective. But obviously these things change. So if you're talking about the distinction between like or the ways in which we are focusing on what constitutes our mark of blanket, I agree. And I don't think this is a new idea or that we need to focus on the community. I think religions, at least a lot of them, have been saying this for a long time. I'm not going to talk about Judeo-Christianism, although, you know, there's interpretations of it in that sense. I'm really talking about more about Hinduism and Buddhism and the religions that preceded them. It was very much about this idea that this mark of blanket is an illusion. You are hyper focusing on what constitutes the ego, and you're kind of missing the forest for the tree. And if you understood that this boundary can be relaxed, that you can sort of shed that even in your own mind, which is something that I know Lars Sandved writes a lot about meditative
Yeah, I
practices.
love his
They
work.
do. Yeah, Jonas Mago as well. You can relax these, and effectively your feeling of boundary goes away. Maybe effectively your boundary does go away because boundary is a function of measurement to some extent. So yeah, I think this isn't really a new idea. I think a lot of our scientific concepts have been like largely influenced by these ideas. I think it would be, I think a lot of hubris of us to say that we've come up with this. In effect, like Foucault kind of nailed it, Althusser as well. We never really get away from prior philosophies or ideologies. Kind of like build on top of them, even if we seek to push them down. So it's the same thing here. I think the one is all or all is one is definitely central to this idea. It's just that now we have very formal math to put on top of it.
Sure. I mean, even kind of something like what Slavoj Žižek is saying, and the Buddhism could be understood as different ways to a similar place in a sense. I mean, all of us are in a way trying to grasp it and also at the same time changing it. But as you were saying that, it does make me think that there is a importance too in understanding that the representation, which I think is what is usually meant by map, isn't the process. I don't know. I think you might push back on that, or maybe you agree, but I do think sometimes we confuse the representation of all of this, like the actual maths or the language, or the image or the marker itself with the action that that marker is creating in the world. Do you see any distinction there, or do you still just kind of say it would all be, the same?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I feel like I might have an inkling, but I can answer one part and then you'll have to maybe clarify
Yeah, I
for
can
me.
explain if you want.
So to me, a representation can be a process, the process of representing, and representation is simply a momentary byproduct of this time of representing. And you could qualify a representation as, let's say, a manifold or a path, but it's still a function of this action of representing, and therefore I don't think they're differentiable. Like, for instance, the self, I know that there's been a lot of theory that push in that direction, suggesting that the self is selfing. It's not a thing which exists. It's a process of engaging with reality, and through the boundary, therefore having a sense of what constitutes what you need and how you can act relative to what you need, and what are the constant elements or more consistent elements of what you need over time. And that's why we have a sense that something core to us remains, but over time we change. We can see that nonetheless. You are not the person you were 10 years ago, hopefully. So can you maybe clarify your question?
Like the ship of Theseus a bit, all the parts can change, but there's a pattern that remains. I think I really mean it in a literal sense. I mean, of course, this word representation in neuroscience, we use it one way, and philosophy, we fight about it in another way. It's like, but I really mean it as representing. So let's try to go back into the personal a bit, like something, about with social media or something where there's an image that is itself not ever static, but that we might confuse that image with the actual trajectory to which that image is connected, I guess,
Yeah, okay. So that's okay. So there's multiple ways to tackle this question. In neomaterialism, the idea would be that everything is about how things interact. So effectively, you should always separate the interacting elements, but at the same time, there is nothing that exists prior to that interaction. So in that sense, the image is its trajectory. There is nothing that precedes its trajectory, because that it's not a thing in itself. It's a thing which has effects in the world. There is another way that you can consider it, which is there are multiple paths that can be taken and will sort of find a connection point, even if they are not aiming from the same direction and they're not going in the same direction. In that case, you could say, well, yes, okay, so that point here is essentially meaningless because you could have taken it from that vector or that vector, and therefore the image in itself doesn't necessarily contain anything which dictates the vector you're going to take. So I'm sort of gonna caveat that in two ways. The first way is that yes, you could have taken multiple vectors, but there's a finite number of vectors that go, well, it's not exactly true, but let's assume that given some regularities, there's a finite number of vectors relative to all the other vectors that go through that point. So it is constraining. In any case, it is constraining. For instance, an image will be perceived, and I know this sounds silly, by people who can perceive it. This means anybody else who can't probably will not be affected by the image in the same way. So there is a regularity here. There is a constant.
Sure, I think there's affordances. An insect's not gonna,
That's right, exactly.
encounter that the same way.
But the second thing is there's other regularities. Like, for instance, you could say that this is a pink shirt. This is just a pink shirt. There's nothing in the shirt that says anything more than it's a pink shirt. It's not even really a shirt, actually. It's just cloth. But I know that it's pink. You know that it's pink. And most men in North America know that it's pink. They therefore most likely will not wear this sort of cut with the shoulders and the pink. Some might, but in regularity, they will associate this very traditionally with femininity. And you could say, well, it's not contained in the shirt. It's like, well, it's true. But the historicity can't really be abstracted from everyone's cognition because they exist in a world where that historicity shaped their cognition. So it's it's not quite true that the images should be separate from their trajectory, because part of their trajectory was already defined by the patterns that we gave them. So I don't know, I hope that answered the question to some extent.
I mean, it's more just a topic I try to explore, but yes, I mean, I love what you're saying. It's just, I guess I think there's something different about something like a language or image because of the intersection of all the different trajectories in this kind of way that isn't connected to a body, one body. It's so like as you described your shirt, that's a very interesting, and of course it depends on all of our, as humans, all of our trajectories of how we've been taught what pink is as kids, and like you can't separate it from every moment of our life, exactly where we live and so on. And of course in different geographical or emotional or conceptual spaces we'll have different understandings or experiences of that shirt or a doll or whatever we want to talk about. But I think something happens in society all the time. I don't know if you agree that we assume that we're all experiencing that shirt. Your shirt is now the object of this conversation, but we all experience that shirt and we think everyone's experiencing the same way we are. And so what I'm trying to do is like, I don't feel like we pull it apart enough to understand that, yes, it's connected to trajectories, but not one trajectory. And that all the time, everything that we're encountering is being processed differently according to each spatiotemporal point. So there's a sort of system 3, I like to think of it, instead of fast and slow within the body, it's more of a community, Daniel Kahneman kind of processing that's going on. And I feel like if we could put some focus on it like that, it could be helpful.
Absolutely. And I think, okay, so let's talk about maybe a topic that's a little bit, it shouldn't be, but it is controversial, and explain how that factors into the question. What has the queer community tried to do by calling themselves queer? They've tried to take a statistical pattern and sort of nudge it away from where people want it. So this isn't saying that there are statistical patterns doesn't mean they're set in stone. It just means when you take a population, they're likely to be on some distribution to think in a certain way. But you can push the distribution somewhere else. And that's why I like this statistical manifold, because it doesn't really, first of all, it doesn't say that you and I will be on the same spot. It says we are likely to be within a range, most likely, but we might be in different points on the range. And then it says, well, okay, if this constitutes an attractor and I know what factors contribute to it being an attractor here, I can use these same factors and push them over here. And I think that's kind of brilliant and beautiful and empowering, because now we know, well, we can just reappropriate a bunch of things. I can decide that pink is not a feminine thing. In fact, it doesn't represent that at all. Now, the problem is I don't control every factor. Like, I'm still going to get perceived as a woman. And so, well, by virtue of association with a woman, okay, but I can make or ask people who engage with me, if they are not considering themselves women, to wear pink. And I enjoy that, and it makes me happy. And if they want to contribute to that, they can. And lo and behold, most of my boyfriends have worn pink. Like, it's no longer associated with femininity to them. It's just associated with happy and joyful and cool.
Yeah. I was about to say, usually pretty cool guys wear pink these days. But,
right, exactly.
Yeah, but that actually speaks to something really fascinating too, is that how these statistical regularities can shift according to something like awareness. It's another topic I wanted to ask you about a little bit, is like, do you see a difference between this cognitive and the kind of conscious or being or awareness or attention? Because you were talking about Buddhism and all of this, and I think in some way, if you start in that tradition, you're aware of everything as one and the whole and so on. And there's some kind of way in which the dichotomy side of things, the reductionist side of things is kind of, I don't know, not as familiar. And then, vice versa, if we want to give these big kind of awful generalizations of different religions or parts of the country where you start with a more reductionist, and the idea of thinking of everything as whole is different because it's about the individual and all of this. And it seems like the thing that changes that is what you're just describing in terms of this shift, like we want to shift, pink is going to be cool, and who knows, in 200 years maybe only guys wear pink because it's shifted all the way to there. But what does that? Is it something like awareness? And I want to try to link this to the active inference work, but I wonder how you see that, like consciousness, cognition, intelligence, are those different? Where's the attention in that for you?
Oof.
It's a hard one, I know.
No, I mean, in general, consciousness is broken down. Awareness is just one part of it. And I think that's probably correct in the sense that sentience doesn't necessitate awareness per se. I don't think. I think you could have, well, I mean, awareness in the sense of an integrated perception, an integrated qualitative perception is more what I'm going to say.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't mean consciousness the way it's always talked about, where it's like you're aware of yourself. I really just mean the feeling of being alive, or being alive, being
Yeah.
itself. And that can,
Okay.
of course, become being aware of your own self as a self and all that.
Yeah, I mean, see, this is an interesting question because it gets to the core of what constitutes qualia, right?
Mm.
Like, is qualia only this right now, what we think we're experiencing together, or does it go much deeper and are yourselves, to some extent, conscious and have some degree of qualia by virtue of being able to react into information in a way that like pushes entropy away? Because lots of things react, like potentially if you kick a rock it moves, like it has had a reaction to what you did. It's just not a reaction that effectively felt like an action. It didn't feel like it had control over where it intended to go next relative to where it wants to go. And there's a lot of words in there, right? Like want to go, like the notion of wanting seems to be central to what we consider to be life or consciousness. So if these are more what we consider to be consciousness along Mark Solms, maybe a lot of things might be more conscious than we think, and they may not require what we understand to be awareness. But if we break down awareness to its most central component, i.e., there is some information that is encoded and acted upon, or at least gained more precision, I feel like that's closer to a panpsychist even conception of what constitutes consciousness. It feels like something's missing though. Like if awareness is all that's required, then what happens when you meditate and you become sort of like flatly aware? Are you not conscious anymore? Is there no precision here? What constitutes like the very nature of a color or something? Is it that you break reality apart somehow and you encode it such that it has differentiability? Is that required? I don't really have the answers to these questions.
No, of course.
We're aiming in a direction, but obviously this isn't solved.
Well, so yeah, I guess like you said something earlier about it nothing being set in stone, and I kind of think sometimes we do think of representations as set in stone, like the colored, is what it is, or the math even. When we represent something, we just assume it's static. And in a way it is static in this weird universe that we've built of language, right? It does move, of course, language changes, words change, but in that kind of, if you just take a very tiny slice of it, it seems static relative to everything else. And I guess, when you talk about qualia or something, that's digging into that a bit of, I don't know that I really think there is qualia actually. Like, I think, what if we just go back down to the very basics and think of something we're always measuring or assessing. So this is a measurement or an assessment already. But we do that, the body does that with itself, right? And that could be something like qualia, or that could even be something like thinking. And that's kind of different than me verbalizing that in language. But the action itself feels to me the same kind of action of an agent moving through its environment in an active inference sort of way, adjusting to regularities, all the stuff that active inference describes. I don't see how that doesn't also apply to something like me as an agent who now has language, considering myself as an agent and thinking of my own thoughts. To me, it seems like the same process.
I mean, I agree. Effectively, everything is recursive, right? Like, I know that Maxwell really likes this idea of, oh crap, when you have these figures that are recursive, I forget.
Fractals or?
Fractals, thank
I
you.
love fractals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, so he's passionate about them, and to him, that's
Mm,
how you can perceive time and reality and space. And I think I agree with this. It's all quite recursive. So the notion of saying words and hearing them back, if only for yourself, but also from others, and getting pinged back. This is a very fractal pattern where we're going to
mm,
get more and more precise. So I think there's something to that nature. And if we go back to your initial question, which was, how does awareness and consciousness factor in being able to shift societal patterns? Um, I think it gets to an interesting question of whether a group can be conscious as opposed to just individual units within the group are conscious and then they produce
mm.
patterns, emergent patterns. And I think Mike Levin also gets to these questions as
Yeah.
to whether intelligence and therefore to some extent potentially sentience can happen in the relationship between nodes. And I agree with that. That's what you said earlier, right? The intelligence happens within communities, even if it's communities of cell that exchange information. Here, I think that there's a possibility that what we're experiencing is just not fully being at the level of the sentient layer that is above us potentially, but we are getting some messages from it, some signals from it, which constitutes culture. And so what we're doing at this level is telling it, whoa, this doesn't work for me. Oh my God, move, move, move. And when this pattern agglomerates enough, when there's enough of a signal, it gets passed upward, and potentially that's when it starts shifting, like an Ising model type thing. So I could totally see how by being the only way for you to move things somewhere else is by being able to measure what the thing is now, right? So yeah, I do believe that in this sense, there's a degree to which awareness factors in our capacity to move things, because I think awareness or focus gives you the capacity to add precision and determine how far away from your desired or preferred state you might be.
Yeah, you mentioned Michael Levin, and we could think of it as kind of as ways we're navigating, like intelligence. We could think of it as the way that life or being or whatever we want to call it is making its way or navigating whatever the encounter is at. And it could be at different landscapes. It could be in the geographical world, as an insect doing whatever, or a human. It could be in conceptual space. It could be in linguistic space, morphogenic, all these spaces, right, that we are setting as we're measuring. And I guess something like what you just described, which is a very important issue, it's kind of in the human social space, and that space perhaps changes through communication. Or you talk about potentiations, and it's a change in potentiations, I guess, or potentions. Am I saying it wrong? The Husserl idea of like um
Protension?
opportunity. Yeah, right, thanks. So in a way, when something changes in society that's changed in the laws or something, such as the way women are treated or what our rights are, it what has changed there? Is it that uh, in this navigating space, certain spatiotemporal agents have expressed through the system 3 languages or whatever what's happening, and that it's wrong, and somehow spread that through the group so that the group itself understands that it's wrong? Or, I mean, this is all very hard and awkward, but I just like, how do we get an idea of what's happening there in terms of something like minimizing surprise, or changing the priors, or
So to me, it's akin to structure learning, where you're essentially carving different ways that you can have observations mapped to states, or different ways that just states in general are carved. And then you do Bayesian model selection, where you determine that a model actually works better for you to minimize free energy. So I think that's what it is when you add a new state, for instance, like when you're saying there's a new concept, here you go. You're now proposing that there may be a better way to measure reality, and
but it's coming out
therefore,
of something, right? Like it's a script too. You're changing the
yeah,
script. So it's
no, I
not
mean,
that you've just
exactly.
proposed a new concept, it's that you've together shifted the script's regularities, right?
It's embodied, exactly. It's embodied. None of this is fully one or the other. It's completely connected, and this gets back to the historicity, right? Like there has been historically groups that feel a lot of error, and eventually it gets to the point where they have to act on it. They have to do something about it, And because some slight subtle shifts happen in other places, they get more and more and more of an opportunity to have a policy that is going to actually phase shift them away from the prior situation they were in. Unfortunately, those phase shifts are never as clear cut as we would like them to be. It seems like anytime you really integrate a new concept, a new script, let's say, it does constitute a phase shift, but there are still things left over from the past. So we can see it in the historicity of the US, for instance, right now. A lot of people saying, oh, no, this thing is over. It has been over for 200 years. And the rest of the people are like, maybe some concept seems to have changed, but there's still a lot of artifacts from the past that have followed us, regardless of this ability to break the representation in different ways. So it's not, I don't think it's as simple as we change the representation and the embodiment will change. It's more like there's errors, you change your model of the world, and thus you will now have also probably to change your actions, because with a new model, it may be possible that the prior policies you were on no longer fit. And so now you have an uphill battle to get the rest of the system to follow you to actually changing this policy. So I think this is what we can observe, and I think it gives a lot of credence to this idea that social groups in general act like their own Markov blanket, like their own agents to some extent.
Yeah, sure. It's again where you're setting the scale of the Markov blanket. But that's very fascinating to think about in terms of the role that technology plays in that change. So something like one of these movements where people are treated wrong and clearly, you know, seen in a way that's not accurate, and they have to change that by coming together and, you know, shifting the regularities more or less, often with something like, you know, force, whether through language or image or whatever. Often technology plays a really big role in that. I mean, because as you were talking, we have to remember all that's developmental and there's no gap. It's all coming from many trajectories joined together. And technology has been a way that people, like the first images of, you know, when people saw it, then they knew it was real or something, or radio, TV. Now, you know, we can go all the way through the internet into something like AI. So two things as we kind of wind down is I wonder how you see the role of technology in this. And, you know, it does relate back to your own work and where you started and where you are now. You're now using technology in a way to maybe help open up some of this community change space, or I don't know, maybe that's too idealistic, but I would just wonder what you think about that. And yeah, I'll just leave it there for now. But
So this is a sort of grandiose idea, but if we understand consciousness as the capacity to integrate information such that it is encoded on a form of boundary, and that boundary is sort of aimed at potentially maintaining the agent that has the boundary, and you consider AI to be anchored within a system, I think what it says is that there's a possibility to make more manifests this integration of information through what AI can do, which is basically integrate information and synthesizes to do something useful, which is what cognition does, right? That's what we do. We're trying to get to that. Unfortunately, currently, we're getting to a point where we can only integrate certain kinds of information, and when we do integrate it, it can only do a certain kind of thing. Like, it doesn't do everything. It does one thing very well, or it does another thing very well, but not both at once, and it can't generalize from one to the other. We're trying to get towards that. That was what people thought they saw in ChatGPT. They thought they saw a generalist. Turns out it's not exactly a generalist. It's more like a really good language machine that, because language is structured and generally what you feed into it is structured patterns of language, you don't just feed it garbage, it tends to have encapsulated some of these regularities, but it hasn't encapsulated the understanding, the causal layer that allows you to understand that because thing is this way, another thing is this way. That's not quite what ChatGPT has, or GPT in general. None of the others do either, LLMs in general. We are getting towards a point where we might, but the point is, it may become this sort of, you could say conscious, you may not want to say conscious, you could say overarching layer that integrates information. And that's kind of beautiful, but at the same time, a little scary, because I think I know who I am. I think I know what groups generally think I belong to them. I don't know what boundaries are encapsulated within the system that is bounded by a given AI system. So when you're sick, when something goes wrong with your body fights it. It tries to get rid of it. Because obviously, right, you want to maintain your regularities. I think everybody is sort of seeing AI in this way, and that's why you saw the emergence of Grok, which was a non-woke AI, because people were like, well, I want to be the thing which is represented in that boundary. I don't want something else to be represented. People are very afraid of biases in AI because they're like, well, if AI is going to be this integration layer and it thinks something is good and I don't constitute what is good, it's going to discriminate against me. And we've seen that. We've seen AI discriminating against sub-communities because the historical data chosen had this pattern of discrimination that identified these groups as groups that were not part of what is represented in the AI. So
Yeah, I don't think
that's
that's clear sometimes, that the LLMs at least are trained on data, and it's just like we were talking about with a life. As we develop, we're sort of everyone says stuff to us and they tell us pink is for girls, so that's what we spit out unless we see another option or someone breaks that open. But with the LLM, it can't learn anymore, so it's just whatever you've put into it, it's just going to stick on that. So
well, I mean, there are RLHF patterns, so we could. The problem is we haven't figured out how to do it well.
yeah.
So the continual learning is not exactly continual, and
Well, that's
even if
kind of what active inference AI is sort of trying to do, right?
right, so that's the thing. So
Yeah.
AI active inference is supposed to be non-static by very nature, and so you would constantly have a system that adapts to its surroundings. But I think this notion of a biased AI needs to be a little bit flipped on its head. Maybe what we don't need is an unbiased AI. Maybe what we need is a
Yeah.
lot of very locally biased AIs that just focus on this perspective, that understands it has a perspective and
Mm.
is couched in that, such that we would know what to use at a given time.
That's a wonderful idea, and so dangerous and so wonderful, because it really matters then that everyone understands that they're biased, that the AI is biased. So that's again that awareness thing of how do we, because that's actually really smart what you said. I mean, that could work if everyone understood that it's biased. It's kind of like with the social media where people don't understand that they're in a feed that's giving them an
What they want to
orientation of
hear.
the world. But if
Yeah.
we understood that, we could even play with it and look at all the orientation. So there's always a scaling too of awareness, I guess, to go back to that.
No, absolutely. I think it is. I think the key question is who gets to define the bias that we're going to adopt for a given situation, and that's not a solved question. That's where we get into ethics. And again, I think technology is starting to wake up to the fact that they need ethics in order to do anything, because their power can no longer go unchecked. Like lots of companies have ethics boards now. So these tools are coming. I hope they come fast enough.
Yeah, and there's a transparency in active inference AI. At least they're trying to build that in. So it's people are aware of it. It reminds me of like the priests who used to only be the ones to read, so they could sort of dictate what the Bible said, and then everyone learned to read, and it sort of changed. I mean, maybe we're there with AI in a weird way, and who knows? But just to kind of end it and come back to your own. We started with your story, and I wonder those problems that you started with and ideas and questions. Have you found, in learning to code, in going through all this really hard work? I mean, this is not easy to digest all the information you digest, and like how has that changed your own trajectories and paths, kind of in the scope of what we've been talking about, or has it? I don't know.
So initially, I started with a very deep love for postmodernism, and then I had to exist in different circles that were very much not postmodernists. And it changes your perspective on things. It makes you qualify things differently. And now I'm sort of going back over the pendulum where I'm like, this qualification of these things I used to like had a purpose. They were trying to do something which was push back on the possibility of critique and push back on the possibility of control of what they're doing because they want to maintain a certain order of things. And so now I'm sort of going back over these things and having perhaps more nuanced perspective over my previous leanings, but I'm still finding that these tools are useful. Like Foucault, Constructivism, these are very, very useful frameworks to understand what's going on and how we might be able to counter it, such as educate everybody. Just give everybody the tools to understand what's going on and use them as well. Don't just let it be in the hands of a very select few who then get to decide without your input, and therefore maybe you'll be on the lucky side, but maybe you won't be.
Does that have to do with self-esteem too? Another topic that you've written about? Does all that stuff you just said, having that and bringing that back in, do something for the phenomenology of the spatiotemporal sort of awareness within the Markov blanket in terms of empowering or giving some?
Yeah, I think
Space.
self-esteem is just a tool that enables you to either try to fit within the group if you find benefit to it, or flip against the group if you find that this isn't working for you. And there are obviously psychological factors that either keep you within a low self-esteem or allow you to try to flip such that you can now grow your self-esteem relative to another group. I think that's why it's important for certain movements to say X is beautiful, because it doesn't matter whether they believe it or not, it doesn't matter whether others believe it or not. What it is a social tool to help them grow their self-esteem, to create enough momentum that they can now be represented in something where their interests and beliefs are forefront.
All right. That's good. There'd be more questions, but it's over. The hour is over for now, and that was a fun ride. So thanks so much. I really appreciate your perspective and the work you're doing.
Well, thank you for reading it and chatting with me.
It was great. All right. Be well.